everyone, and welcome to our Princeton Review Daily Live AP live stream. Today's session is dedicated to the AP English Language and Composition exam. So thank you so much for joining me. Whether you have some experience with this test and you know a little bit about the changes coming for May, or if you're starting out with no knowledge, hopefully today I can tell you some new things that you need to know, some valuable information for taking the test. So, first of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Gina Donegan. I am a veteran teacher and tutor for the Princeton Review. I've been doing this for over 20 years. I work with all sorts of standardized tests, including AP exams. And the AP exams I know the most about are the English tests and also AP US History. So today I'm going to give you some information that's really tailored to some of the new changes we're seeing for May of 2020. But we will also talk a little bit about general advice that you need to know for taking the AP, no matter when you're taking it. But I'm assuming everybody here is going to be taking it this year. So here's what we're going to cover today. First of all, what you need to know about the new AP May 2020. So, advice catered to this year's test. We're also going to talk about how you need to prepare, specifically what you need to add to your notes, because the good news is this year you can use open notes, unlike other past years of the AP. So, I'm going to give you some really good tips on what to add to your notes. We may have time to look at some general things about the rhetorical analysis essay, but keep in mind this is only the first of 3 sessions. So, whatever we don't cover today, we're definitely going to cover in future sessions. So, I would encourage you to come back next week for our next one. And if you have any questions as we go along, feel free to type those questions into the YouTube chat. We have a moderator named Blaze. He's going to be monitoring that chat and he's going to let me know what your questions are. And I'd be happy to answer those questions as we go along. Or if you have a really in-depth question, I could even answer some of your questions at the end too. So this is definitely meant to be interactive. If you have questions or comments, I'd be happy to hear them as we go along. So let's dive in. Here's what you need to know about this year's AP English Language and Composition exam. And just to be clear, there are 2 English tests, right? There's the English Language test, but then there's another one called English Literature. And they are 2 different tests. So chances are you're taking the language test. And I say that because that's the more popular of the 2 exams. So if you're signed up for, quote, AP English, find out what test you're taking, but there's a good chance it's the language test. So, what do you need to know about the language test? Well, first of all, this year's test is going to be held on Wednesday, May 20th. So, that means you have quite a few weeks to prepare. That's good news, but that time's going to go by quickly. So, it's never too soon to start preparing. If you live on the East Coast, you will be taking the AP at 2 p.m. in the afternoon, 2 p.m. Eastern time. But of course, if you're in another time zone, you have to calculate that difference. So if you live, say, on Pacific time, that means you're going to be taking the test at 11 in the morning. And I hate to say it, if you live in Hawaii, you're going to be getting up really early. And some of you might even be taking this in other time zones. So, if in doubt, you can simply go to a time zone converter in Google and find out what your time is, or you can even go to collegeboard.org and you can find the complete list of times. But it's 2 p.m. Eastern for the East Coast folks. Now, unlike other AP exams, you will not be dealing with a full length test. This is not going to happen in person. This is not going to happen at school. So, even if you do go back to school, let's say you go back to school in May, that would be great. But you won't be taking the AP exam in school. And chances are most people won't be back in school by then anyway. You will be taking the test strictly online. So that means you'll need to have access to your own device and you will link up to a link of software, or not software, but simply a link set up by the College Board. You'll be starting the test at that appointed time, and it will strictly be a 45-minute test. That's it. Unlike the usual AP, which is hours long, This one is only 45 minutes long. That's great news. Um, and you will not have to deal with any multiple choice questions. As a matter of fact, you will only be dealing with one type of essay. It's called the rhetorical analysis essay. So this sounds like it's easy, right? And in some ways it is, because you're only preparing for one type of essay. But here's the downside: your entire AP score is based on this one essay, right? So we have to make sure this one essay is really good. So there's pros and cons to the fact that it's only 45 minutes long, but I think for most people it's a pro. So let's look at the positive side here. We only have to do this for 45 minutes. And if you're taking multiple AP exams this year, then um, that's only 45 minutes per test. That's a little easier than you thought it would be. But it means we have to make sure our one 45-minute essay is as good as it can be. So we're going to talk about some key things you have to know today. You have the option of taking this test on a variety of different devices, but I'm going to strongly suggest that you take this on a laptop or a desktop computer. And the reason I say that is it's good to have access to a keyboard. Um, Obviously, you don't want to be hunting and pecking on your tablet on screen keyboard, right? That would not be a good idea. So, if you have a laptop or a desktop, I highly recommend you do that. If you don't have a laptop or a desktop, you do have the option of doing this on a tablet or even a smartphone. However, in that case, the best option for you would be to hand write your essay and then take a photograph of it with your tablet camera or smartphone camera and actually upload it to the College Board. So that is an option. However, what would you rather do? Type an essay or hand write it? Personally, I'd rather type, because, first of all, then you don't have to worry about the quality of your handwriting. You don't have to worry about crossouts. You don't have to worry about whether the picture of your essay shows up properly, right? It's so much easier to be able to type this. And I think most people can type faster than they handwrite something. So the preferred method is laptop or desktop. However, if you don't have access to that, you do have other options. And I'm not saying you shouldn't take those other options. It's great to take the AP in whatever way you can. But just be aware the preferred method would be laptop or desktop. Now, what will you actually be tested on? Well, the College Board understands that most of you are out of school. You probably haven't been in school for almost a month, right? And so, therefore, you're not sitting in a classroom learning the AP material like you would be normally. Now, some of you may be doing online sessions with your English teacher. That's great. If you are, then that's excellent. But not everyone has access to online learning right now. So, what the College Board has decided to do is they've decided that they're not going to test you on certain material that would normally be covered at the end of the school year. So, for example, let's say you're also taking the AP US History test. You won't be held responsible for any historical knowledge after 1945. That's great. So, if you haven't talked about the Vietnam War, don't worry, it's not going to be tested. However, we know AP English is a little different, right? It's not like you're covering material in a chronological timeline. So it's not like we can just lop off everything after 1945. With AP English, there are certain concepts that your teacher would have covered in the class, and maybe certain other concepts that she wouldn't have covered, but it could vary a little bit from teacher to teacher. Technically, the AP is not going to be testing you on material from units 8 and 9. So if you've seen the official AP course exam description document, then everything that's listed under units 8 and 9 should not be required for the test. However, I'll be honest with you, there's not a lot in units 8 and 9, okay? Most of what you need to know is what you need to know, regardless of what's in 8 and 9. So, on this particular test, I wouldn't put too much stock in the fact that they're not testing certain concepts. I think the reality is the more you know, the better off you're going to be on the essay, because the more you know about rhetorical analysis, the better your essay will be. So, for this particular test, let's just assume you need to know a little of everything. And if you know a little of everything, you're going to be better equipped. But for other AP exams, it may be useful to know that they're not going to test you on things you would have learned at the end of the year. Now, let's talk about one of the fun parts of this year's AP, which is the fact that it's technically considered open book and open notes. That's not how most tests work, right? Most of the time, you have to learn this stuff, you have to memorize it, and you have to retrieve that knowledge on test day. For this year's AP exams, you are allowed to use notes. You can have as many notes as you want. The notes can be on your computer, the notes can be handwritten. Um, it's even possible to do a quick little Google search. However, let's talk about what this means for this particular test. First of all, as you know, the AP English composition exam is not primarily a test of what you know. It's more a test of your ability to read and dissect passages, understand them, look at rhetorical analysis, right? So it's not like you're being asked, when the Civil War started. It's not that kind of test. So the reality is, even though you do have access to open notes, um, chances are you're not going to be using them a lot. That doesn't mean you won't be using them at all. It just means that this is not a test where you can just write everything down and expect that you're golden, right? You do have to actually do some thinking for this test. Um, and the other thing I want to caution you about is that if you do use notes, which you should, you need to make sure that those notes are easily accessible. You need to make sure that you're not doing a lot of hunting around for these notes. So they need to be in an obvious document on your computer that you can access easily, or they have to be written down in a notebook. I don't want you to be doing random Google searches during the exam. That's not a good strategy. You only have 45 minutes and you can waste a lot of time looking things up. That's not the best way to go. As a matter of fact, I will go so far as to say that for this test, for the AP English language test, if you're doing any Google searches, you have not prepared. And I'm not saying that because I don't want you to do Google searches. I'm just saying that because it's really a waste of time. And later on in this session, I'm actually going to give you a pretty good list of all the things you need to have in your notes. So if you want a shortcut, I will give you that later. Now, for other AP exams, perhaps the way you create your notes might vary, but we're dealing with AP English language today. So, in my opinion, your notes need to be fairly concise. They need to all be in one document, easy to access. And that way, if you do need to look something up, you can do it quickly because, again, you only have 45 minutes to write this thing and then 5 minutes to upload it to the College Board. That's going to go by really fast. And one of the basics to getting a high score on this is to write as much as possible. So you just don't have time to fish around in notes too long. But we will talk a little bit more about what should be in your notes. By the way, if you have any doubts as to whether you are registered for the AP, just be aware you can go to collegeboard.org and there's actually a section called My AP. So if you go to myap.collegeboard.org and log in, you can find out if you're actually registered for this test or perhaps the literature test. If you're not sure, you want to make sure that you know what tests you're registered for. But my understanding is if you're not already registered for an AP exam, it may be too late to do so. However, if you were enrolled in an AP course, you should have been enrolled in the test. So between now and May, just make sure you are signed up. And again, for any of you who just came in, you're welcome to ask any questions that you might have by just typing into the YouTube chat. We have Blaze, our moderator, who is keeping an eye on those questions. And I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. And if I don't have the answer, I'll get back to you on it later. So right now, we're just covering some of the basics, how this test is going to work. And by the way, there's still some things that we may not be sure of, but we are going to be running at least 2 more live streams for AP English Language and Composition. So if I find out any new information, I will definitely pass it on to you next week. All right. So as I mentioned earlier, all AP exams are now only 45 minutes long. So the good news is you only have to write one essay. The bad news is your entire score is based on that one essay. So it has to be a really good essay. You will be allowed to log into the College Board system up to 30 minutes early, and I would suggest you log in early. You do not want to start this test late, right? You want to be all ready to go, get that trigger finger ready to go when the clock starts so you can immediately start writing your essay. If you are eligible for any accommodations such as extended time. And by the way, these accommodations are usually available to people with documented learning disabilities. You will be able to receive those accommodations on the College Board AP test. So that's another reason to go to My AP and find out if you're registered and also find out if you've been approved for those accommodations. And that way, if for some reason it's not showing up in your account, you have time to contact the College Board and get that remedied. Okay, so as I mentioned, the one and only essay you will be doing for the AP English language test is the rhetorical analysis essay. And this one, by the way, is often considered the hardest. So you will need to do some good prep for this. And we'll talk a little bit later about what the task is. You will not have to deal with any multiple choice questions whatsoever, just the one essay. Now, let's talk about technology. I mentioned earlier that you do have some different options. You can technically take this test on any device that has access to the internet, a computer, either laptop or desktop, a tablet, a smartphone. I'm suggesting, just my own opinion, that it's going to be a little easier to do it on a laptop or a desktop just because you'll be able to use your keyboard and type quickly. But if that is completely out of the question, if you don't have one, if your parents don't have one, if you can't borrow one, then it is also possible to handwrite your essay. Take a screenshot picture of it and upload that picture to the College Board, and somebody will grade your essay by reading your handwriting. So, if that's the only option you have, that's fine. Let's not knock it, but just be prepared and know what you want to use on test day. Now, here are the rules. As I said, you are allowed to use notes, books, notes. You could even Google things if you want to, but I'm going to suggest you don't do that because it takes up too much time. However, there's one thing you are not allowed to do. You are not allowed to collaborate with anyone else while you take this test. So you can't have anybody in the room telling you what to write. You can't be texting your friend while you're taking the AP. These are all bad ideas. Now, you might be wondering, well, how would the College Board know if I cheated, right? How would they know that? Maybe I could just get away with it. Probably not. Here's why. You will not be monitored with any kind of a webcam, okay? And nobody from the College Board is going to be standing in your living room watching you. However, here's what happens. Um, if your essay looks a little unusual, maybe your essay looks really good, like maybe somebody helped you with it. Here's what the College Board can do. They can actually go to your AP English teacher at school and they can say, here's John's essay. Does this look like John's writing to you? Does this look like the kind of essay that John was writing last time you saw him? And if your English teacher says, no, there's no way John wrote this, you could be in big trouble. All right. So the College Board does have ways of finding out if you were the person who wrote the essay. And the bottom line is, you don't want to get yourself into that mess, right? You don't even want them questioning whether you were the one who wrote the essay. Now, that doesn't mean that if you write a really good essay, that you're going to be suspect. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that if it looks like you got any help, that could be a big problem. Another thing to be aware of is the College Board is going to be using anti plagiarism software. Okay, so you write your essay, they will run your essay through this anti plagiarism software. And if you copied anything off the internet, they'll know it. All right, so no plagiarism is going to be allowed here. That's a big no-no. So use your notes, use your textbooks, do whatever you want there, but do not collaborate with anyone else and do not plagiarize anything. This has to be your own material. And believe me, I'm on your side. I want you to get the highest score possible, but I don't want you to take any risks that would jeopardize your entire AP score. And, I don't want colleges to see anything that might look suspicious either. So let's play by the rules, but we can definitely use the rules to our advantage. So this is some of the things I just talked about. You will not be monitored by any sort of microphone or webcam, which is nice. But you will be subject to the anti-plagiarism software, and it's even possible that your AP teacher could be asked to check for any irregularities in your writing. So make sure this is all your own material. All right. So again, for those of you in the chat field, it looks like I have about 30 or 40 people here. That's a good turnout. If you have any questions, feel free to type those into the chat, and Blaze, our moderator, will pass those questions on to me. At this point, we've now covered what you need to know about taking the test online at collegeboard.org. We've talked about making sure you're registered for the test, making sure you have a good, comfortable device that's going to work well for you, a um, preferably with a keyboard, right? And that's what I'm fishing for, keyboard. That's the best way to do this. But if you don't have a device with a keyboard, then you can also hand write the essay. So if you have any questions about just generally how is this going to work, how am I actually going to take this thing, let me know. Otherwise, we are going to talk about some more specific information that you need to know for setting up your notes. This might be actually the big bonus for this session is I'm going to tell you exactly what things to put in your notebook. No questions so far. All right. Then let's get into the good stuff. What is the rhetorical analysis essay? Again, this is the only essay you're writing. So, what are they asking you to do? It's going to be really important to approach it in the right way. Well, what they're going to do is they're going to give you a fairly long text. Okay, so typically these texts are taken from speeches or written material. It could be something from the historical past, like a speech from Elizabeth Cady Stanton, or it could be something more modern, a speech from Condoleezza Rice, perhaps. So these can come from a variety of sources, but they're always going to involve an author or a speaker who is arguing something, right? Arguing a point, trying to convince you of something. And so after you read this text, and by the way, it's going to be fairly long, right? It's going to be 4, 5, 6 paragraphs. It's not going to just be a short quote. It's going to involve some reading. And so that's why that 45 minutes is going to go by quickly, because in part of that 45 minutes, you have to read the text. And I would say it's going to take you a good 5 minutes to read it. Let's see. So somebody asked a good question. Can you annotate on the document they give you? That's a good question. I don't think I know the answer to that, although my gut says no. Okay. My gut says you're not going to have like a highlighting tool. Um, so I think what you're going to need to do instead is take notes. And I would suggest, go old fashioned, get out a piece of scratch paper and take notes. Because, for instance, on the actual written exam, right? If we weren't doing this online, on the actual written exam, we would just have a pencil and we'd be circling things. So I wouldn't assume that you're going to have sophisticated tools like that, but that's a good question. I think I'll investigate that, and if I'm wrong, I'll let you know in the next session. So you'll be given this long essay or speech or text. After you read it, you're going to get a set of directions. The directions are always pretty much the same. Okay, so what I have on the slide here is pretty much exactly the directions you're going to get. So these directions say, read the passage carefully. Write an essay that analyzes the rhetorical choices the author makes to convey her message to her audience. In your response, you should do the following. Respond to the prompt with a thesis that analyzes the writer's rhetorical choices. Select and use evidence to support your line of reasoning. Explain how the evidence supports your line of reasoning. Demonstrate an understanding of the rhetorical situation. And finally, use appropriate grammar and punctuation. So, what are they actually asking you to do? Well, first of all, let's talk about what they're not asking you to do. Okay. These are the biggest mistakes people make with the language and composition test. Number one, they're not asking you to just summarize everything that the author said. They're not testing you on whether you just understand what you read. That's sort of too easy. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't summarize, right? It just means that that's not what they're actually asking for. Number two, they're also not asking for your opinion. So if Elizabeth Cady Stanton is talking about giving women the right to vote, doesn't really matter whether you agree with her or not. Hopefully you do, but whether you do or not, that's not the point. As a matter of fact, you could disagree with her, but you could still write a really great essay because your job is just to analyze how she used certain rhetorical devices to build a case. So let's look at the key words in these directions. First of all, they say rhetorical choices. Then again, they say rhetorical choices. They do talk about a thesis in the first bullet point, right? However, this is not the kind of thesis you might write for a different kind of essay. This is not a thesis that says she's correct or she's incorrect. This is not a thesis that says, Elizabeth Cady Stanton talked about X. This is a thesis that analyzes the rhetorical choices. That's what the thesis is about. And what else do they want? They want evidence. Evidence, right? That's important. You can't just say what she did. You have to prove that she did it by selecting certain lines or certain evidence from the text. Then it says an understanding of the rhetorical situation. Well, that sounds an awful lot like rhetorical choices, right? But rhetorical situation might have a little more to do with context. For instance, who is her audience? Or what was the occasion on which she gave this speech? Those are the things that go into the rhetorical situation. And then this last bullet point is really important too. You need to write well. You need to not only use proper grammar, proper spelling, and punctuation, but you also just need to write in a manner that's elegant and interesting if possible, right? That's going to go into your score as well. So, unfortunately, you can have great ideas, but if you don't deliver them well, it's unlikely that you'll get a high score. Now, bear in mind that even though this is a computer based test, you won't have access to things like spell check or grammar check. You'll be writing in a very simple word processing program. It might allow you to backspace, delete, maybe cut and paste, but it will not tell you when you've spelled a word wrong. It will not give you suggestions for words that you should use in place of other words. So you won't have those kinds of tools you have access to in Word. You have to think for yourself here. Um, does that mean that one spelling mistake is going to kill your score? No. Okay. I don't want to scare you and say that one spelling mistake is going to kill your score. However, if you have multiple spelling mistakes, if it's all over your essay and you spelled the same word wrong 12 times, that's certainly going to detract from your score. You're not going to get a perfect score. I can guarantee that. So you do have to be somewhat conscious. The best advice is if you have trouble with spelling, try to rely on words that you know how to spell. Okay. If you have any doubts about the spelling, find an alternative word. And when it comes to grammar, you know, check things like verbs and pronouns. That's where people tend to make the biggest grammar mistakes. Um, oh, that's a good question. Would you have to disable Grammarly or would the test automatically get rid of it? Hmm. I don't know. I've never used Grammarly. It's a good question. Here's what I would guess. Number one, I think the College Board would probably ask you to disable those sort of things, or it would be built into the system that they would not allow you to use those. That would be my guess. But you know, Blaze, if you have any knowledge of that, feel free to jump in here. I don't know if Blaze knows the answer to that, but a lot of these things are new, right? Because we've never done an online AP before. So that's another good one that I'll have to write down and get back to you. They haven't said anything definitive. Yeah. So, okay. So, what we'll say to whoever asked that, my basic advice is don't disable anything unless they tell you to, right? I mean, do whatever you want as long as it's not breaking the rules. And as far as I know, they haven't created a rule about that yet. That's a good one. Yeah, I would guess the interface is going to cut those things off and not allow them. That's my guess. But, we may not know until we get to test day. So a lot of these things are unknown. Yeah, unfortunately, if you have a lot of typos, that will count against you because one of the things the grader is grading you on is your use of basic English mechanics, things like grammar and spelling. But like I said before, if you have one or two, it's not like the grader's going through there with a magnifying glass looking for all your mistakes. It's just that if there are many mistakes, they start to become distracting. And sometimes a lot of mistakes can even interfere with the grader's ability to understand what you're saying. So just try to be careful of it. But it's not like one or two mistakes is going to kill your score. Not at all. It's just that there can't be lots of them. It's something you have to watch out for. And that's also a reason why I'm going to suggest that you leave at least a couple of minutes to proofread, right? Check your work. Go back and reread the things that you wrote and see if you can catch those spelling and grammar mistakes. Okay, so we've seen the directions. We've seen what they're really asking you for, which is rhetorical choices. Rhetorical choices. What do they mean by that? Well, this is where I'm going to give you the stuff that you need, right? This is the big money, okay? If you were waiting for the good stuff, here it is. I have put together a list of all of the things that you need to know. You need to put these things in your notes. So, if you have the ability to take a screenshot or if you can write really fast or type really fast, um, this would be a good time to start screenshotting. So I have 3 slides, and these 3 slides cover most of the things that you need to know in order to be ready for the rhetorical analysis essay. You need to know literary terms, also known as literary devices. Now, these are the kinds of things that show up in all sorts of texts, right? We can see these things in fiction, we can see them in nonfiction. The rhetorical analysis essay prompt will be nonfiction, okay? It's not likely to be an excerpt from a novel or a short story. However, any of these things could show up in nonfiction writing. The key is you have to know that these things exist and be prepared to discuss them if they are appropriate. I'm not saying that all of these things will show up in one essay. That's not going to happen, right? But you could have, 3, 4, 5 of these things show up in one speech or one piece of writing. And so you need to know these things exist so that you can discuss them. Somebody asked, will the grader be more lenient since I'm only given 45 minutes? I don't think so. No, and here's why, because you're only writing one essay. This in some ways this is less demanding than a typical AP test, right? So I don't think it matters to the grader that you only have 45 minutes. The key is um, your entire AP score rides on this essay, so they're expecting you to do your best work. And of course, you are allowed to type it as opposed to freehand writing it. So, in some ways, your essay should potentially be longer if you have the ability to type it. So, I don't think we can believe that the graders are going to be more lenient. If anything, they might be tough on us because we have access to things like notes, right? We don't usually have access to notes. Now they're going to expect that you know what an oxymoron is because it should be in your notes. Okay. So we can't count on leniency on this test, I don't think. But maybe they'll surprise us, right? So here are all the literary devices that you should know. There are some weird ones on here, like what's a malapropism? Okay. Well, mal means bad, right? So a malapropism is like an incorrect term for something. Or maybe you've never heard of anthropomorphism. Well, anthropomorphism is when you take animals and you give them human characteristics. What are the chances you're going to see that in your essay prompt? Well, probably kind of slim, but if you happen to see it, it's good to be able to wheel out that term and say, this is anthropomorphism. The grader's going to like that a lot. Um, well, I'm not saying that you can only know the devices and write a perfectly good essay. I'm not saying that. But for instance, let's say you notice that the author uses a specific kind of diction. Okay, diction has to do with word choice. Well, you want to know that it's called diction, right? because it's just good to use the right terminology. So you might not see any metaphors, you might not see any anthropomorphism, but I bet you're going to see diction. I bet you're going to see some imagery. So a lot of these terms are really useful. So I'm going to disagree with whoever told you that. I'm going to say all of these terms are useful and you should add them to your notes. Why not, right? If you have open notes, you might as well have everything available to you. So that's my first slide. Okay, my second slide is maybe where the meat and potatoes are, which is rhetorical modes. So this is what the commenter was saying. We shouldn't focus on devices. We should focus on what the writer does. Well, everything on this slide, it falls into that category of what the writer does. Um, Hopefully, your teacher taught you about ethos, logos, and pathos. Though I call those the big three because those are the ones I always try to look for first. I think it's fair to say that almost any piece of writing they give you for the rhetorical analysis prompt will involve one of these. So, in case you don't remember them, let's talk about them. Logos means appeal to logic. So, it means that the writer or the speaker is using perhaps facts or statistics or some kind of logical reasoning to persuade you that something is true. Ethos has to do with credibility or authority. So this could be either an appeal to the author's own credibility or authority, or it could be an appeal to someone else's credibility or authority, trying to prove something by saying, well, this is what the experts say, right? That would be ethos. And then pathos is appeal to emotion. When you try to get someone to feel a certain emotion, to feel perhaps sentimental emotions and persuade the reader or the listener that way. So, again, those are the big three because you will see at least one of those and maybe all three of them in an essay or a speech. And those are definitely good ones to start with. But you also have more specific modes, and those are the ones that are listed on the rest of the slide. So, for instance, you might notice that a writer or a reader is classifying things in a really orderly way. And by the way, that would probably indicate logos, right? That sounds like logos to me. You could have analogies, which are really just comparisons, like apples are just like oranges. Okay. Cause and effect. One thing led to another. That's a way of proving something to the reader or the listener. Sometimes you could just have descriptions of things. If you describe something enough, then it may lead the reader to a certain conclusion. Induction and deduction, if you don't know the difference between these two, just write them down, add them to your notes, and look it up. It's really not too complicated, but we probably don't have time to talk about it. It pretty much just has to do with whether you're reasoning from part to whole or whole to part. Then we have examples or illustrations. That's pretty clear. Process analysis, which usually has to do with a step by step approach to analyzing something. Sometimes the author will define key terms. This is really common. It's always good if you notice it. And then finally, sometimes we even have narration and storytelling. Even though technically this isn't fiction, the author could still be telling you a true story in order to try to prove a point. So those are rhetorical modes. Hopefully you took a screenshot or wrote those down. And then I'm also going to give you some rhetorical fallacies. Um, and these, may be a little less important than the rhetorical modes because, again, some of them are really specific and you won't see nearly all of these in one text, but you might perhaps see one of them. So, for example, when people say you're jumping on the bandwagon, well, what does that mean? That means you're trying to prove something to somebody by convincing them that everyone else believes it, right? This is what all the cool kids are doing, so you should do it too. That's bandwagon. Then we have ad hominem. An ad hominem argument is when you appeal to an authority figure. Like my doctor says I should exercise more, and doctors are really smart people, so I'm going to do that. That's an ad hominem argument. Um, and let's see, somebody asked a question: would the terminology be best to include in your thesis or in the analysis? In your analysis, yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about the structure of your essay. All the things that I'm talking about right now are things that should show up in your body paragraphs. Okay, not necessarily in your thesis, because your thesis is going to be a very general statement that simply talks about what the author's purpose was and how the author generally argued the argument. But these are really specific things that should show up in your body paragraphs. So we have appeal to authority. We have shifting meanings. What does this mean? This means you might try to argue something by using a key term in different ways. And that usually means it's a bad argument because you're sort of using a sneaky method of defining your key terms. Appeal to sentiment, that's the pathos. Now, pathos isn't always bad, right? Sometimes pathos can be really effective. But if that's all you're doing, if all you're doing is appealing to somebody's emotions, it's probably not a very good argument. Then we have the slippery slope. Slippery slope means that you're making the case that because something has happened in a small amount, that it's going to get out of control, and before you know it, everybody will be doing this, which is probably an overgeneralization. Um, And yeah, it would definitely impress readers if you notice these fallacies. That's why I'm giving them to you, right? That's why I want to see you put these things in your notes, because if you happen to see one of these things and you mention it, it looks good to the grader. Now, on the other hand, it's possible to just describe these things without using the term. So, for example, if you can't remember ad hominem, or it wasn't in your notes, that's fine. You don't have to use the term ad hominem, but you do need to know that this kind of rhetorical fallacy exists. And frankly, I think it's better if you just call it what it is, right? Ad hominem. We have access to notes, so we might as well use them. We don't have to memorize all these things this year, which is great. Um, and then we have false dichotomies. False dichotomies are, black and white. Only black and white exists. There is no shade of gray. That's a false dichotomy. We have red herrings. Red herrings are pieces of information that are just a diversion from the point. They're not really relevant to the main point at all. Straw man. Straw man means that you're setting up your opponent's argument in a way that's incorrect or oversimplified, and then you're trying to tear down that argument even though your description of the argument is not accurate. We have bad comparisons, like, my dog loves to go for a walk, therefore my cat would love to go for a walk. That's a bad comparison. We have causation. Sometimes we aren't always sure what causes a certain effect, so if we draw a conclusion about that, we may be wrong. Circular reasoning is interesting. Definitely add this to your notes and look it up on your own. But frankly, you're not likely to see some circular reasoning on your test. Maybe, but probably not. And then we have hasty generalizations. This happened once, therefore it's going to happen every day for the rest of my life. That would be a generalization. So I just gave you, again, 3 slides. If you can learn these modes and fallacies and literary terms, create a list, create a notebook or a digital copy of these notes. Just have them there in case you need them. Again, you're not going to see all these things on your test, but even if you only see like 4 or 5 of them, you're going to be glad you have the notes to remind you. It also gives you something to look for, right? Like, what do you start with? You start with ethos, pathos, logos. Then you start to look for maybe some of these other things. Oh, do I have a rhetorical fallacy? Let me see if I can find it. So this is a way to get the juices flowing, get some ideas in your head so that you're not just sitting there and staring at the prompt, not knowing what to write about. Now, somebody asked a good question. Does narration as rhetorical mode essentially mean using anecdotes? Yes, yeah, anecdotes are short stories. So that is narration. Although it could be telling somebody else's story, right? So sometimes the anecdote is your own experience, your own story, but it could be telling somebody else's story. So that's why I just call it narration, but anecdote is a great word to use as well. Somebody said, I thought you shouldn't mention fallacies because you're kind of criticizing the author. um well, let me be clear. Your goal here is not to criticize the author, right? It's not to make Condoleezza Rice seem like she's dumb, right? No. um But if you happen to notice something obvious, then to not mention it would be, there would be something missing. So let me be clear, you're not working with texts that are inherently flawed. Like they're not deliberately choosing bad arguments. That's not the point. Um, but if you notice, let's say that there is some pathos and maybe it seems a little over the top, it's not bad to call that out, right? It's not bad to say there was some pathos here and it was a little strong, maybe even to the point of being too much. But fortunately, the author made up for it with some, logos in the next paragraph or whatever. So I'm really just giving you ideas, right? I'm not saying you should focus on any one of these categories to the exclusion of the other. The most important category is rhetorical modes. Okay, this slide is probably the most important information I gave you. But then after that, we do have those literary devices, literary terms, and the fallacies. They're all good to know about. Now, if you were taking the entire AP exam, then all of these things would be equally important, right? But for the rhetorical analysis essay, the rhetorical modes on this slide are actually your number one most important thing. And by the way, all of these things are found in a lot more depth in our copy of Cracking the AP English Language and Composition. So if you happen to have that book or if you're looking for a great resource, we go into a lot more detail as to what all of these things are in that book. Okay, so again, if you have any questions, let me know. Don't be shy. We've got a small group, so I do have time to answer questions. But I also wanted to just tell you a little bit about how the essays are scored. And again, this is somewhat unknown because this AP is not like the others. But the way the AP essays are normally graded is they're normally graded on a scale of 0 to 6. Zero, you wouldn't get a 0 unless you didn't write an essay, right? But for most people, it's going to be 1 to 6. Okay, so 6 is the highest score, 1 is the lowest score. And then typically that your essay scores are combined, and they are then combined with your multiple choice score to form the overall AP score, which is on a scale of 1 to 5. Now, of course, this year there is no multiple choice. There are no other essays. We're just dealing with one essay. So how is the AP going to deal with that? Well, I suspect, if I had to guess, that the graders are simply going to give you a score of 1 to 5. Okay. So even if your English teachers have been scoring you on a scale of 1 to 6, chances are this AP grader is not going to be scoring 1 to 6. It's going to be 1 to 5. And then that will be your final AP score. But there should be multiple graders. Okay, so it's not like your entire AP score is riding on one reader. There are going to be at least two readers. That would be my guess. And again, if Blaze has any information about that, he can correct me. Um, but the most important thing to know about grading is that the grading is done fairly holistically. Okay, so that means there is no master checklist of things that you absolutely need to talk about, or else you won't get a 5. It's more like the grader is just going to read your entire essay, and based on the entirety of what you've discussed, will give you a certain score. Um, there is definitely a rubric available. If you go to AP students at collegeboard.org, there's definitely a rubric there. Where you have to be careful is, again, the rubric may be on the scale of 1 to 6, but of course the AP scores are actually 1 to 5. So that rubric may be, not totally precise for this year's test, but it'll still give you a really good idea of what the graders are looking for. Um, so if I had to really narrow it down, what do you need to do to get a 4 or 5, which are the most desirable scores? Well, number one, you need to focus on rhetorical analysis, right? Don't just talk about what the writer said. Don't give your opinion on the topic, right? You must focus on rhetorical analysis, and you must find at least 3 to 5 major points that you can focus on in your essay. And you need to write as much as possible. So they give you 45 minutes. A good guideline would be to spend about 5 minutes or less reading the text. Leave yourself a couple of minutes at the end for proofreading, but that means you need to spend a good 35 to 40 minutes writing, and you should write as much as you can. As a matter of fact, my best advice is type and don't stop typing, right? Because if even if you make a mistake, you can go back and fix it. But do not just sort of sit there and stare at the wall thinking of ideas. Do not Google things left and right, okay? Because that's a waste of time. You should be writing as much as possible. And you also need to make sure that your ideas are structured well. So here's a suggested structure. In paragraph one is your introduction, and you need to accomplish a few things. Um, First of all, try to make your first sentence great because that's the first impression you're making on the grader. You need to be clear about your thesis. Now, your thesis must be focused on rhetorical modes. So the thesis does not have to do with just, again, what the author said. It has to do with rhetorical modes. Technically, a thesis is something that's debatable. That's, someone else could have an alternative opinion, but that doesn't mean you need to go too complicated with your thesis. Okay. As long as you're focused on rhetorical modes, you're doing the right thing with the thesis. You also need to briefly list off the pieces of evidence that you're going to use to try to prove your thesis. Briefly, okay? We don't need to reproduce everything that's going to go in the body paragraphs, but you need to just give the grader a rough idea of what you're going to be talking about. Essentially, what you're trying to do is give the grader a brief overview of what your essay is going to be about, and that makes it easier for the grader to give you a high score. Now, when you get to the body paragraphs, I would strongly suggest 3 body paragraphs because if you're writing 3 body paragraphs, that means your essay is long. If you really don't have time for 3, you could get away with 2, but 3 is probably better. The idea is to organize your body paragraphs around the type of rhetorical mode that you've discovered and the type of evidence that you discovered. So, for example, if you notice that one of the really obvious rhetorical modes in the essay is logos, then you could devote an entire paragraph to logos. And you want to provide evidence that the author used logic to try to prove the point. Now, you might also work in other literary devices there, like maybe part of the logos was that the author used a lot of definitions of key terms. So point that out as well. So it's not like you're just talking about one thing per paragraph. It's that you're trying to group your discoveries in a logical manner. So each body paragraph is devoted to one type of rhetorical mode or group of modes. Um, and is this a quantity over quality situation? That's a good question. It could be. I mean, if you're really on the ball and you find like 10 things that you want to talk about, the question is, can you organize them in a way that makes sense? I do not want you to write an essay with a laundry list of 10 things in it. But if you notice that your 10 things really break down to about 3 things, then you could group them together in 3 body paragraphs. Okay, so I don't want to discourage you from writing a lot. Writing a lot is a good thing, but you also don't want your essay to just become a list, right? You want it to be a reasoned grouping of things that all logically belong together. If some of them don't logically belong together, so for example, let's say you found some random fallacy like, oh, this looks like bandwagon. If it doesn't really go with any of the other points that you're trying to make, then leave it out, right? Because we don't want to just be tacking things on randomly. We do want a logical structure. You were told that 2 body paragraphs would be better than 3. Maybe it's just a matter of opinion. Let's put it this way: if you're going to have 2 body paragraphs, they need to be really long. Otherwise, your essay is going to be short. So, my opinion is 3. But you can go with 2. You just need to make sure they're nice long paragraphs. Yeah, so I think that answers the next question too. But don't do more than 3. Okay, if you have more than 3 body paragraphs, it probably means your essay is not well organized. If you only have 1 body paragraph, it means your essay is not well organized or it's too short. So 2 or 3, my recommendation is 3, but you can do 2 as long as they're nice and long. And then your last paragraph should be a conclusion. The conclusion doesn't have to be terribly long. Um, as a matter of fact, if the rest of your essay was nice and long, your conclusion could be a little short, and that would be fine. But the conclusion does two things. It, first of all, shows the grader that you finished writing your essay. You do not want your essay to look unfinished. You don't want to make it look like 45 minutes was up and you were unprepared for the end, right? You want to show that you finished the essay. And you're also trying to restate some of your major points. The conclusion should basically remind the reader of your thesis and your position and the major points that you use to develop it. Um, by the way, in my opinion, the introduction is much more important than the conclusion. So the most important thing about a conclusion is just to have one. But the introduction needs to be nice and thorough and long and impressive. The conclusion, even if it's just a basic restatement, you're going to be fine as long as the rest of the essay was really good. So that is the suggested structure. And we're starting to run out of time here, but before we wrap up, I just want to encourage you all to ask any questions that you might have. Looks like we just got a new one. Can the conclusion just be your thesis restated? Yes, not in exact words, right? Don't be creative, right? Say it in a slightly different way. But yes, you are just rehashing the same ideas. You're not really coming up with any new ideas. Just word it in a slightly different way and you'll be fine. So before we wrap up, I just want to give you some ideas of things that you can do on your own if you want to continue prepping with us. First of all, these live streams are every day at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Every day we do a different subject, but we will be doing English language again sometime next week. So watch our schedule at Princeton Review in YouTube and check out the next episode 2 of English language, where I will give you even more specific advice on how to write the rhetorical analysis essay. You can also check out princetonreview.com. And at princetonreview.com, we have lots of information about AP tutors who are available if you feel like you need some one-on-one help with this. We also have things called AP cram courses. This is a 6-hour course that gives you everything you need to know for the AP exam. And since we're only talking about the rhetorical analysis essay, you can learn a lot in 6 hours. I also want to highly recommend our cracking books. If you go to Amazon or any website that sells books, you'll find books called Cracking the AP US History, Cracking the AP English Language, Cracking the AP Calculus, you name it. We have a title for every one of these tests. And those books go into really good detail about what you need to do for the rhetorical analysis essay and all of these modes and fallacies that we talked about. By the way, you can also get this in Kindle form if that's easier for you. So, thank you so much for joining me today. You had some really great questions, and I'm happy to continue answering questions for a couple of minutes if anybody has any. So, thank you very much for your time. It was a pleasure working with you all, and good luck on the AP. And maybe I'll see you again next week for episode 2. What does rhetorical mean? That's a great question. I never did say, did I? Okay, rhetoric is the art of using language effectively. So, for the AP English language exam, rhetorical simply means how you put words together to form an argument, to form an idea. And so, rhetorical analysis is looking at how the author or speaker literally put the words together to form an argument. So, it's a good question, but you'll definitely want to use that word rhetorical in your essay. So now you know what it means. All right. So this is the end of the live stream. Have a good afternoon, everyone. I'll see you next week.